The hospital echoed with the sound of rushing footsteps, urgent whispers, and machines beeping in despair. Inside the emergency room, 15 of the nation's most celebrated doctors stood helpless, sweat trickling down their foreheads as a billionaire's life slipped away before their eyes. Money, status, and the best medical expertise seemed useless. But then, in the middle of the chaos, a quiet figure appeared. A janitor's young black son, often overlooked and dismissed, noticed something no one else dared to see. What happened next wasn't just a miracle. It was the moment that exposed the true genius hidden where the world least expected it. The hospital towered over the city skyline, its polished glass walls gleaming like a fortress of science and wealth. Inside, the air carried a sharp sterility, filled with hurried nurses, anxious families, and the low hum of machines keeping fragile lives afloat. It was a place where powerful men came to be saved, where billionaires believed their money could buy them more time on Earth. On that day, however, money seemed meaningless. The richest man in the city, a billionaire known for his arrogance, his empire, and his belief that he controlled everything around him, lay unconscious on a hospital bed. His heart monitor screamed with uneven rhythms, each sound echoing like a countdown. Around him, 15 of the country's most brilliant doctors scrambled, their expensive suits hidden beneath white coats, their reputations on the line. Yet, with every passing second, their confidence crumbled. Whispers of confusion rippled across the room. Some shook their heads, others tapped furiously on tablets, searching for answers that refused to come. For once, titles, degrees, and prestige meant nothing. Meanwhile, just outside the glass doors of the emergency wing, a janitor quietly pushed his mop across the floor, his young son trailing behind him with wide, curious eyes. The boy had been raised in these sterile hallways, not as a patient or visitor, but as someone who observed silently from the shadows. He watched everything, the way nurses adjusted machines, the patterns of alarms, the body language of panicked doctors. He was invisible to them, yet he saw it all. What no one knew was that this boy carried within him a mind sharper than anyone could imagine. And as the situation worsened, fate was about to draw him directly into a crisis that would expose truths about genius, humility, and the arrogance of those who thought brilliance only belonged to the privileged. The billionaire's private medical team worked like a machine under pressure, yet nothing was working. The patient's breathing faltered, his chest rising unevenly, as if life itself was slipping away. Machines beeped in chaotic rhythms, a digital chorus of alarm that made even the most seasoned doctors sweat. The hospital had spared no expense. Specialists in cardiology, neurology, and internal medicine surrounded the bed, each one handpicked and flown in at the billionaire's command. They had been called the 15, the best of the best. They were used to applause, magazine features, and speaking engagements where audiences hung on their every word. But in this moment, their silence spoke louder than their accolades. Every attempt failed. Every remedy collapsed under the weight of uncertainty. A billionaire's life, one that had been lived with power and entitlement, dangled by the thinnest of threads. Outside the sterile room, the janitor pushed his mop in slow, careful strokes, pretending not to notice the chaos just beyond the glass. His son, however, was transfixed. He stood frozen, his small hands gripping the handle of the mop bucket, his sharp eyes darting to every flicker of the monitors and every desperate gesture from the doctors. To him, it wasn't just noise and panic, it was a puzzle, a complex rhythm of data, sound, and behavior. While the adults drowned in their panic, the boy's mind began connecting invisible dots. Yet no one noticed him. No one had ever noticed him. The janitor was a shadow in the billionaire's empire, a man who cleaned floors beneath the shoes of men who barely acknowledged his existence. His son inherited that invisibility, overlooked, underestimated, dismissed. In the hierarchy of wealth and status, they were nobodies. But genius has no uniform, no expensive diploma, no title etched in brass. It burns quietly until the world forces it to ignite. The boy's breathing quickened. He tugged lightly at his father's sleeve, whispering something only he could hear. The janitor glanced nervously at his son, then toward the guarded hospital doors. To even think about stepping inside that room was unthinkable. This was a sanctuary reserved for the wealthy and powerful, not for a janitor and his child. Still, the boy's insistence grew stronger. His eyes shone with a conviction beyond his years, as if he already knew that time was running out, not just for the billionaire on the table, but for something bigger, something symbolic. Inside, a doctor slammed his clipboard down in frustration, muttering that there was nothing more they could do. Another doctor argued that they needed to try riskier experimental methods. Tension boiled, egos clashed, and yet the patient's life slipped further away. And that's when the boy's chance would come. A moment where silence could no longer contain what he knew, a moment where the invisible would be forced into the light. The silence in the room was suffocating. Machines still screamed their warnings, and every second stretched like an eternity. The billionaire's skin had turned pale, his breath shallow and uneven, the weight of death hovering over him like an uninvited guest. Suddenly, the door creaked. All eyes darted toward the entrance. Standing there was the janitor, trembling, clutching his son's hand, his presence alone enough to draw glares of outrage from the 15 doctors. "You can't be in here." One of them barked, their voice sharp with authority. Another stepped forward as if to shove them out, but the boy slipped past, his small frame moving with a strange confidence that silenced the room. The janitor froze, heart pounding, torn between shame and pride. But the boy, his son, was unstoppable. His gaze locked on the machines, the wires, the monitors. His eyes flickered as though translating a secret code only he could understand. The billionaire's life hung on a razor's edge. And here was a child no one respected, no one valued, walking into the center of a storm of men with degrees and medals. The head surgeon sneered. "Get him out before he—" "Wait!" The voice cut through the room like a blade. Everyone froze. It wasn't the janitor. It wasn't the boy. It was the billionaire's chief physician, a man who had already tried everything and failed. His eyes were locked on the boy, sensing something unusual. Something raw. Something no textbook could teach. The boy pointed at a monitor, his voice calm yet urgent. He gestured toward a setting, then at a piece of equipment that had been overlooked. His words were simple, childlike, yet carried a weight of truth the professionals couldn't deny. For a moment, the doctors hesitated. Pride battled desperation. Could they really listen to a janitor's son? But as the alarms grew louder, as the man on the table slipped closer to death, the choice became clear. And in that instant, the room shifted. The invisible child was no longer ignored. All eyes followed his lead. The moment the boy's instructions were followed, a hush fell over the room. Fingers raced across controls, switches were adjusted, and for the first time in hours a shift could be felt in the air. The billionaire's chest, which had been heaving unevenly, slowly began to stabilize. The alarms grew quieter, the frantic red lights dimmed, and the faint rhythm of life returned to the man lying on the bed. A collective gasp erupted. The doctors stared at the monitors in disbelief. 15 of the best-trained professionals, experts who had built careers saving lives, had been outshined by the son of a janitor. A boy society rarely noticed, much less valued. Tears welled in the janitor's eyes, his trembling hands pressed against his face, as though shielding himself from the enormity of what had just happened. For years he had endured whispers, smirks, and prejudice in the very halls he cleaned. He had been invisible to the wealthy patients, and even more so to the men in white coats who dismissed him daily. But now, through his child, the truth stood undeniable. Brilliance can bloom anywhere, even in the most overlooked places. The billionaire's hand twitched. Slowly, his eyes fluttered open. A wave of relief swept through the room like a tide. The doctors, still stunned, instinctively stepped back as the reality sank in. Their expensive education had failed. Their egos had blinded them. And it was a black janitor's son, the boy they never would have allowed near their sacred operating theater, who had seen what nobody else could. The chief physician finally spoke, his voice thick with humility. "We owe this child more than we can ever repay." The billionaire, still weak but conscious enough to comprehend, turned his gaze toward the janitor and his son. For the first time, he saw them, not as background figures, not as mere workers and their families, but as equals. His lips trembled, not from weakness but from the weight of shame. The shame of having lived a life surrounded by wealth and privilege, blind to the quiet genius hidden in plain sight. In the days that followed, news of the incident spread through the hospital like wildfire. Nurses whispered about the boy who saved a billionaire. Staff members who once mocked the janitor now avoided his gaze, their arrogance shaken. Even the city's newspapers caught wind of the story, framing it as a miracle. But for the janitor, it wasn't about headlines or recognition. It was about watching his son, his pride, his light, stand tall in a world that so often tried to silence him. It was about knowing that dignity, intelligence, and worth were not reserved for the wealthy, the white, or the powerful. And for those who watched, the story carved a scar into their conscience. How many lives, how many talents had been overlooked simply because of the color of one's skin or the uniform one wore? How many dreams had been buried under prejudice and arrogance? The billionaire, now fully aware of the life he nearly lost, made a vow that day. He would never again allow himself to be blind. He would invest not in the privileged, but in the overlooked. He would ensure that the world never again ignored voices that deserved to be heard. The boy had not only saved a life, he had revealed a truth too powerful to be forgotten.